You ever throw one of those pebbles into a pond and watch, like the ripples spread out? That's kind of what thinking about world population feels like to me.
Yeah.
It's this massive, always changing thing. But when you really get down to it, it all starts with like individual lives.
Yeah. It is a fascinating paradox when you think about it. I mean, we talk about billions of people,
Right.
but it really boils down to the impact on each person, each individual within that massive number.
It's so true. And that's exactly what we're going to be like diving into today. We're using Wikipedia's world population article.
Yes.
We're going to try to unpack these billions, like all the different trends that are, shaping how the world is growing and what it means for all of us. I was reading this article and it said that after the Black Death, it took Europe 2 centuries, like 200 years, to recover its population.
It's really a stark reminder, isn't it? It makes you think about how these events in history, even the ones that are just unimaginable in their scale, really are stories about individual lives that are impacted.
Oh, for sure. And that's what I think is so captivating about this whole topic.
Yeah.
So we're going to be unearthing these huge historical milestones. We're going to be looking at different regions, how they're booming or, believe it or not, actually shrinking. And we're even going to take a peek into the future.
And what's really interesting about these future projections is that they're not like set in stone, are they? I mean, they really are influenced by a whole host of factors, including the decisions that we're making today.
Okay, so let's start with a big milestone, a recent one, November 2022. We officially hit 8 billion people on planet Earth. I remember that being a pretty big deal in the news.
It was a pretty significant moment, demographically speaking, but what I find even more compelling is the fact that the growth rate, it isn't what it used to be. I mean, it's actually slowing down.
Really? So we're not adding people as fast as we were. Okay, so unpack that a little bit. What's going on there?
Well, it took, for example, roughly 12 years for the population to go from 6 billion to 7 billion. However, the projections are estimating it will take about 15 years to actually hit 9 billion.
Okay, so what is it that's driving that slowdown? What's behind that?
A lot of it really has to do with something called the demographic transition. As nations develop economically, healthcare improves, birth rates tend to decline.
That makes sense. Whenever I'm looking at these future population projections, you see this huge GE range. Sometimes they say we're going to hit 9 billion by 2050. Sometimes it's way more. What's the deal with that? Why is there such a big difference?
You've hit on a really common point of confusion. The UN, for example, they project somewhere between 7.4 to more than 10.6 billion people by the middle of the century.
That is a huge GE gap. So what makes it so hard to know?
Well, it really comes down to the variables that they have to plug into their calculations. Things like fertility rates, life expectancy, even migration patterns. Because the future is never a sure bet, there's always going to be this degree of uncertainty.
It makes you think about how the things we do, even today, could shift those numbers just a little bit. Like we have some agency in this. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure, but there's, billions of lives involved.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, we can't talk about population without considering the resources that support it all, can we?
Oh, absolutely. More people means more mouths to feed, more need for resources, energy, everything. It's all connected.
It is, and it's interesting, the Wikipedia article even mentions this. It talks about this debate that has been going on for centuries, really. Is population growth directly tied to how much food we can produce?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to make sense on the surface, right?
Yeah.
More mouths to feed.
Right, exactly. And they highlight these experts, people like David Pimentel and Russell Hoffenberg, who argue just that. They say, historically speaking, when food production increases, population tends to follow.
And they give some good examples, too, like the Neolithic Revolution, when people shifted from, hunting and gathering to farming, and bam, there's a population increase.
Exactly. And then again, with the Green Revolution in the 20th century, new technologies, higher crop yields, and sure enough, another population surge.
But I hear a but coming.
You know me too well. The thing is, just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean that one actually caused the other. It could just be correlation, not causation.
Okay, so maybe other factors played a role.
Exactly. Like, for example, better healthcare during the Green Revolution, right?
Right.
It's not just about the increase in food necessarily.
Right. And, the Wikipedia article does a good job of sort of laying out these counter-arguments as well. They make the point that it's not just food, it's also access to things like water, energy, even political stability factors into all of this.
It's true. It's like this giant game of Jenga. where if you pull the wrong piece,
Exactly.
who knows what's going to happen?
Very good analogy. That's why predicting the future, even with something like population,
Yeah.
can be so tricky. There are just so many factors, so many interconnected systems at play.
Well, and speaking of, looking back, one thing that really surprised me in this Wikipedia article was just how much the global population has fluctuated throughout history. It's not just this straight line constantly going up. There are some pretty big dips in there, too. Oh, absolutely. We have this tendency to think of population growth as just this straight line going up and up.
Right.
But it's really not the reality at all.
No, not at all. In fact, the article even said that we only have reliable population data going back like a few centuries.
Yeah.
Anything before that is anyone's guess, really. Imagine trying to count how many people lived in, like, ancient Rome, for example.
Oh, I know. It's a massive, massive undertaking for historical demographers. They're dealing with all kinds of incomplete records, different ways of even counting people back then.
Right.
And let's not forget about
Infant mortality, that's what always blows my mind.
Exactly. The article points out that, for most of human history, it's estimated like 40% of children didn't even make it to their first birthday.
That is heartbreaking. And it must really throw a wrench into those early population estimates.
Oh, absolutely. It really forces us to acknowledge the loss that was woven into a lot of these historical trends. But it also speaks to the resilience of humanity as well, wouldn't you say?
100%. I mean, we've bounced back from some incredible lows. What would you say, looking back, were some of the most dramatic population swings? What are some good examples of that in the Wikipedia article?
Well, a couple immediately come to mind. The plague of Justinian, and then, of course, the Black Death, both of which had a devastating impact on Europe's population.
Yeah, especially the Black Death. That was, what, like 30 to 60% of Europe's population wiped out?
In just a few years.
In just a few years. And we just talked about how long it took for them to recover.
Yeah, it took more than 2 centuries for Europe to reach its pre-Black Death numbers, which just highlights how impactful diseases were, even centuries ago, at completely reshaping entire societies.
Yeah, wow. And it wasn't just Europe that was dealing with these things. The article talks about China facing huge population drops as well.
Absolutely. Things like Mongol invasions and famine really took their toll. Around the year 1200, for instance, China's population was about 123 million, according to the article.
Wow.
By 1393, that number had plummeted to 65 million.
Oh my gosh.
So these kinds of fluctuations, these swings in population, really do reveal this complex interplay between disease, conflict, and even the environment.
Yeah. It all ties back together, doesn't it? But it wasn't all doom and gloom. It wasn't all plagues and famines and things like that.
Yeah.
What about the population booms? Were there any periods where the population just absolutely exploded?
Well, one really significant event that comes to mind is the Columbian Exchange. You've probably heard of that. The exchange of goods and, unfortunately, also diseases between the Americas and what was considered the Old World.
Right, the Columbian Exchange. I've definitely heard of that. But how did that impact population on a global scale?
Well, the introduction of New World crops, things like potatoes, maize, to Europe and Asia actually contributed to a significant increase in food production.
Right, so more food, more people.
Exactly. But of course, like with anything related to population dynamics, it's never quite that simple.
Right.
Because the Columbian Exchange, while it did bring about this increase in food production, also had really catastrophic consequences for the indigenous populations in the Americas.
Because of the diseases.
Because of the diseases, exactly. You see, Europeans unknowingly brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, which the indigenous populations had a very little immunity to.
And we're talking some really big numbers here. The article said that scholars estimate up to 90% of the indigenous population in the New World died from these diseases.
It was a tragic period, and it definitely had a major impact on the population trends in the Americas.
Yeah, it's really remarkable to think about how interconnected the world was even back then. And speaking of connections, let's maybe shift gears a little bit to think about some of those regional trends that we see today.
Okay.
Because the world is not evenly populated, right?
Right.
Some places are really densely populated, while others are having a hard time even maintaining their numbers.
You've hit on what I think is one of the most fascinating parts about this topic. It's not just about a number, a global total, but understanding how these trends, these population trends, are playing out so differently around the globe. And that's actually what we're going to pick up with in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back and ready to really dig into these regional population trends. It's
Yeah.
like we're zooming in on different parts of a world map
Yeah.
and seeing completely different pictures.
Yeah, and some of these might actually surprise you.
Okay.
For instance, most people know that Asia's got a lot of people, right?
Right.
But did you know that it's home to like a staggering 60% of the entire world population?
60%.
Yeah.
Wow.
We're talking 4.6 billion people.
That is mind-boggling. It's like Asia is throwing this massive party
Right.
and everyone's invited, I guess.
Exactly. And within that massive party, you've got like the VIP section,
Right.
which is India and China.
Of course, yeah.
Together, they make up about 36% of the world's population, just those two countries.
Wow. Okay, so Asia's definitely in the lead. What about other parts of the world? Where do things stand?
Well, coming in second, we've got Africa with about 1.34 billion people, about 17% of the global total.
Okay.
And here's what's really interesting. Africa also has the fastest growth rate of any continent.
That is interesting, yeah, because I remember reading that some European countries and even Japan are actually seeing the opposite. Their populations are shrinking, right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of developed nations are dealing with declining birth rates, and they've got an aging population. So it's a whole different set of challenges.
Yeah, completely different problems, right?
Right.
So it's like we've got this global balancing act going on, populations going up in some places, down in others.
Exactly. And the Wikipedia article does a great job of contrasting these trends and how they play out differently in different parts of the world.
Right.
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
No, not at all.
Every region has its own, opportunities and obstacles based on those population trends.
Right, it's like a different population puzzle to solve,
Exactly.
depending on where you are in the world.
Mm.
Okay, so we've looked back at history, we've kind of zoomed in regionally, but what about these big picture future projections?
Right.
What's the overall outlook?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the UN estimates will hit somewhere between 8.3 and 10.9 billion people by 2050. But of course, those numbers come with, a little asterisk.
Right, because it's the future.
Exactly. We can't predict everything. There are so many factors that are influencing those numbers, like economic shifts, environmental changes.
Oh, yeah.
It's impossible to be 100% certain. But even with that uncertainty, I think those numbers really force us to confront some major, major questions, like how are we going to manage resources going forward? How do we make sure that we can sustain this
Right.
and strive for, social equity in a world with potentially billions more people?
It's a lot to think about. Like, I'm trying to picture all those people on the same planet that we have right now, relying on all the same resources.
Yeah, it can be a little bit daunting when you think about it that way, but it's
Yeah.
also an opportunity.
An opportunity. How do you see it as an opportunity?
Well, think about it. A bigger population also means we have a bigger workforce.
Oh.
More consumers, potentially a surge in innovation and problem solving.
Right, because you've got more brains working on the same problems.
Exactly. It's not about being afraid of those numbers, but figuring out how we can actually harness all that potential and turn it into a positive.
Right, it's not about trying to get the number down,
Exactly.
but figuring out how to work with the number, however big or small it is.
Exactly. And I think that's what it comes down to. How we navigate this growth, how we make sure everybody has access to the essentials, how we protect our environment, how we just create a future that is sustainable and equitable for everyone.
Yeah, finding that balance, making sure everyone has the opportunity to live a good life. Now, something that I thought was interesting that the Wikipedia article mentioned was this idea of a population plateau. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
What is that?
I think that's one of the more intriguing aspects of a lot of these population projections. Based on current trends, the UN actually suggests that population growth could slow down so much that by the end of the century, the global population might plateau or even start to decline.
Wait, so you're saying we might actually see a future where the population on Earth is smaller than it was?
It's definitely within the realm of possibility.
Right.
Of course, these are really long-term projections, and they are even more uncertain,
Right.
Those mid-century estimates. But the idea that this is even being discussed, that we might see a plateau, is significant.
Yeah.
Because it challenges these assumptions about perpetual growth that we have.
That's a really different way to think about it.
It really is.
Yeah, because we're so used to bigger is better, more is better.
Right, exactly.
The idea that things might level off or even go down is a completely different way to look at it.
It is a profound shift, and it forces us to kind of ask, What would a world with a stable population even look like?
Right. What would that even look like? Or declining population, right?
Yeah,
How would our values change? How would our priorities shift?
exactly.
So interesting. Okay, that is really interesting. I have to say, I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Is that like really going to happen?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
And unfortunately, there's no crystal ball that can tell us for
Yeah.
sure. But I think the fact that it's even being discussed by demographers, by people who study this for a living, is telling in and of itself. Because it means that our thinking about population is changing. It's not just about these upward trends.
Right.
We're starting to consider these other possibilities.
That's so interesting. It's like questioning those assumptions that we've had for so long about how this whole thing works.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up our, deep dive into this article, was there anything else that stood out to you? Anything you found interesting?
One little detail that I found really fascinating was the comparison of population density in the article.
Oh, yeah. I remember that section, yeah.
For instance, they were talking about Bangladesh, which is geographically a pretty small country,
Right.
but it's one of the most densely populated on Earth.
Yeah, they're packed in. It's like
Exactly. It just goes to show you that it's not always about the total number of people, but about how those people are distributed as well.
right, because that changes everything. Infrastructure, social dynamics, the environment.
Exactly. So, population density is just a whole other layer to this.
Right, a whole other layer to this giant global puzzle that we're trying to figure out.
Exactly.
And I love puzzles, so this is fascinating to me.
Me too. As we start to wrap up here, what would you say, the key takeaway is for listeners? What's something they can kind of chew on?
To me, what's most fascinating about world population is that it's so much more than just statistics and numbers. It's really a tapestry that's woven from billions of different individual stories. Stories of resilience, adaptation, our interconnectedness as human beings.
Oh, I like that.
And I think most importantly, it's a story that's still being written. It's a future that we are all actively creating with the choices that we make.
I love that. So it's not just about these big, scary numbers,
Exactly.
but about remembering the humans behind them. Exactly. And that's actually where I think things get really interesting, because if we can connect this back to the big picture, right? If we can understand those trends, population trends, both past and present,
Right.
it helps us make more informed choices about the future.
So it's not just about knowing the numbers, but about knowing what they mean, how they impact how we live our lives, how much we consume, how we plan for the years to come.
Exactly. Whether it's advocating for responsible resource management, supporting sustainable practices, or even just thinking about our own personal choices about family size and things like that, being aware of these trends, I think, empowers us to actually contribute to a world that works better for everybody.
Right. It's like we're all part of this. We're not just watching it happen.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful realization to carry with you, I think.
It really is like we're all characters in this story, this epic world population novel. And we don't know how it ends yet, do we?
We really don't. And it's exciting.
Right.
But also, yeah, a little bit daunting.
A little bit, right.
It really is. And, it makes me think about that question you asked a little while ago about, what's that one thing
Yeah.
you'd want our listener to walk away with?
Yeah, like that thought-provoking nugget.
Exactly.
Something to chew on, yeah.
Exactly. And for me, looking at everything we've talked about, from those historical swings to those regional trends, even those future projections, the question that I always come back to is this: how do we make a future where everyone has a chance to thrive?
Right.
No matter what that population number is.
Right, because it's not about controlling the number, but about making sure that whatever the number is,
Yeah.
everybody has a good outcome.
Exactly. And I think it's about more than just managing those resources, which is obviously very important, but it's about equitable access to those resources. It's about encouraging innovation
Right.
to meet those needs and fundamentally rethinking our whole relationship with this planet.
So it's about thinking long-term.
Yes.
And making choices today that are going to benefit not just us, but
But
future
sure.
generations.
Exactly. Those billions of people
Yeah.
who haven't even been born yet.
And that might mean changing how we think about things.
Yeah.
How we've always thought about, progress and what it means to live a good life and all of that.
It really might. And that can be a little bit, scary for some people, but it also opens up these amazing opportunities for innovation, for creativity, for collaboration.
Right, because we're all in this together.
We are all in this together.
I love that. Well, for our listeners out there, we definitely encourage you to check out the Wikipedia article, World population. There are so many interesting details in there that we didn't have time to get to.
Yeah.
And most importantly, just stay curious about this.
Keep asking those big, challenging questions.
Exactly. Because the more we understand about all of this, the better choices we can make for the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into world population. Until next time, stay curious.